Well, here we are for week 5 of New Hampshire history. Welcome back. Housekeeping, I think, pretty much just keep getting stuff submitted, and we'll continue on. Next week is the midterm. Please give it some thought. So review your notes, and we'll take it from there. In the meantime, New Hampshire, around 1830 or so, had a population of 270,000, and although we don't think about it much, and perhaps don't like to think about it, there was actually slavery in New Hampshire. There was a peak number of 674 back in the mid-18th century, although by 1786 that was down to a small number, around 40 or so. But it was an active event. Portsmouth was actually, although there wasn't a lot of retail slavery in New Hampshire, Portsmouth was a port, and there were actually slave auctions in downtown Portsmouth. Many of those slaves went elsewhere. But there were a number who lingered, mostly in the Portsmouth area. That was where money was, and there was steady work. Some of the slaves took on surprisingly skilled tasks, running households, bookkeeping, various other functions. And in fact, there was enough of a slave population in Portsmouth so that in 1779, a number of the slaves got together and petitioned the assembly, the legislature, to free them, citing much of the language you hear about from guys like Jefferson and Locke, Rousseau, and so on. The document is extremely well drafted and is included in your readings. You should look at that carefully. We can learn some things from that document. One is that not all slaves were illiterate. They were not unreasoned. There was a sophistication in the argument, and really can be a little surprising when you think of it. So we have that. We know there was a substantial population in Portsmouth. There have been recent excavations in areas of Portsmouth where burial grounds have been discovered, and in fact there's been a development in Portsmouth around that, well worth a detour if you're in the Portsmouth area. For farmers in New Hampshire, slavery wasn't economically viable. If you look at it, in 1850, a slave would cost the equivalent to purchase of the modern equivalent of about $11,000. By 1860, that was up to $21,000. So there was a huge capital outlay. Remember, these were very small, hardscrabble farms, or a lot of times part-time farms, because again, agriculture was kind of a sideline. It was to get stuff to eat. It wasn't any more commercial farming than my going to Market Basket and buying a week's groceries. That doesn't make me a grocer. So anyway, but it was for stuff to eat. It just wasn't economical. In addition, short growing seasons and what have you. And by the way, all the rocks left over from Mr. Glacier. There was a lot of downtime. What do you do with a slave during that period? And you still have to feed them, house them, give them medical care and what have you. It was cheaper to either have more children or hire people and then lay them off in the off season. So all of those factors kept slavery down in New Hampshire. There was also, I think, a certain level of idealism that people just didn't want to have any part of it. As far as leading up to the Civil War, New Hampshire was a strongly anti-slave state. It was there. That's been bothering me there. And the traditions of the Jeffersonian Democrats were, Jeffersonians was not consistent with slavery, although the Democratic offshoot in the South didn't see that as an issue. One of the things that did happen in between things prior to the Civil War was the administration of Franklin Pierce. Franklin Pierce was born in Hillsborough, went to Bowdoin, practiced law, and was somewhat of a hero in the Mexican War in the late 1840s. He served some time in the House and Senate, then came home to practice law. You couldn't make money in Washington back then. And Pierce was not considered a prime candidate, but the Democrats nominated him because he was popular, he was good looking, he was from the North and not ready to kick down the gates of slavery. So he was an ideal candidate for them. He was elected to one term. The reviews on his presidency are at best mixed. There were things that he accomplished, and he actually did what everybody says they want the president to do, is to pick as his advisors the best and brightest, despite of party designation. Well, actually he had a brilliant cabinet, all of whom stayed with him from soup to nuts, and were exceptionally talented. One example, Jefferson Davis was the Secretary of War, and probably the brightest one ever. Davis went on to be President of the Confederacy during the Civil War. Anyway, as things fell apart, the Civil War, New Hampshire by 1860 had a population of 326,000. New Hampshire embraced the Civil War. There was a lot of sympathy for the abolitionist cause. The New Hampshire pulpits and newspapers were both adamantly against slavery, used that influence unhesitatingly. Anyway, when the Civil War came around, approximately 35,000 served in the land forces, approximately 3,000 in the Navy. The privateers were gone by then, and approximately 5,000 were killed in action, and another 5,000 were lost to wounds and disease. New Hampshire raised 17 volunteer regiments, of which 16 actually served, and those were at about 1,000 men apiece. So it was had a huge impact, and when you consider the numbers, that something like 10% of the population was off in service. That's pretty amazing. And when you think of the number of killed and disabled, there weren't a lot of families that, if they weren't impacted themselves, hadn't known somebody who was lost. You'll see, if you look at town squares just about anywhere in New Hampshire, where's find the center of town in the mid to late 19th century, and you'll find a huge monument. You'll see names, rows upon rows of them. And we don't even approach those numbers until World War II with a much greater population. Another of the things you'll see, and I hope that I can get a couple of pictures into the readings, but there are monuments in almost every town from that period. These were cast of generally bronze, and you'll find actually quite a number of them were cast from the same place, parts interchangeable. Anyway, we also saw in the week of the Civil War the founding of the New Hampshire Veterans Home here in Tilton, and which has again evolved over the years. In terms of personages, don't forget George O. Perkins. He was, Admiral Farragut said he was the bravest man who ever trod the deck of a ship. Naval hero from New Hampshire. Pretty good for only having 18 miles of coastline. Anyway, next week's the midterm. Catch the next video for helpful hints on how to take the exam, and we'll pick up after the midterm with manufacturing and railroads. Okay, take care. Go find some sunshine.